take my hat off to a microvolt. This was supposedly said by the Nobel Prize-winning physiologist Herbert Gasser. He'd just been approached by one of his contemporaries, Edmund Jacobson. Jacobson had got it into his head that he needed to measure muscle activity at a fraction of a microvolt. In Jacobson's telling, Gasser said, "I believe that a microvolt is a millionth of a volt. I take my hat off to a microvolt." So what do microvolts have to do with the mind? Well, maybe quite a lot, according to the subject of my talk for today, Edmund Jacobson. The mind, he's going to argue, can be measured in microvolts. To understand the mind is going to mean understanding the body. We run into philosophical trouble when we forget that we have bodies. My suspicion is that philosophers, some of them anyway, are able to think of the mind as non-physical because they're not trained to understand the body. Or more importantly, they're not trained to understand their own bodies, because you can understand how the body works in an abstract way without being able to feel your own body working in a concrete way. Learning about Jacobson can help change that. I don't think Jacobson exactly thought of himself as a behaviorist, but he was a fellow traveler of behaviorism. I consider behaviorism to have philosophical, psychological, and physiological manifestations. In Jacobson's tradition of physiology, which includes people like Ernst Gellhorn and Frank Joseph McGuigan, is an important complement to philosophical and psychological behaviorism. In physiology of this kind, you get a better sense of just what the body is doing when it is doing so-called mental activities. It's worth pointing out that although Jacobson made occasional criticisms of the behaviorist John Watson, Jacobson's disciple, F.J. McGuigan, often cited Watson, Skinner, and other behaviorists with approval. Jacobson's concept of mind is in some respects very similar to that of Watson. You think with your whole body, not just with your brain. In Jacobson's case, his theory developed out of his interest in anxiety. This interest also led him to develop what is essentially the American scientific counterpart of the Asian meditative traditions. Jacobson called his foundational technique progressive relaxation. And consequences of this technique have important implications for understanding the mind. I'm first going to give a little background on Jacobson. And if you want to read along on your own, learn a little bit more, I recommend Edmund Jacobson's book Biology of Emotions very strongly. It's hard to find, but worth finding. There's also an interesting article that gives you some overview of this by Kenton Croker called The Progress of Introspection in America, 1896-1938, which was useful to me in understanding some of the background to Jacobson. All right, let's get started then. So, Edmund Jacobson, some background. He was born in 1888 in Chicago, died 1983. He seems to have become interested in things like tension and anxiety when he was young. His father and uncles once owned a hotel in Chicago. When Jacobson was 10 years old, the building burned down, and some of the people inside were killed. Jacobson noticed that after the fire, his father and other people who had experienced it became much more excitable than they had previously been. Jacobson entered Northwestern University about 10 years later, and as a university student, he says he wanted to understand the nature of nervousness and excited emotion. During his education and in the early stages of his career, Jacobson would come across just about everyone who was anyone in psychology at that time. William James, Ugo Münsterberg, Josiah Royce, Walter Cannon, George Santayana, Edward Titchener, Edward Boring, John Watson, Carl Lashley. He has interesting and often unflattering things to say about most of these people. After Northwestern, Jacobson went to Harvard in 1908 and studied under William James, Hugo Münsterberg, and Josiah Royce, all major figures in psychology and philosophy. Jacobson was disappointed in them, however. They were primarily theorists and did very little in the way of experimentation. Incidentally, he notes that James, Münsterberg, and Royce all died of tension disorders. If true, this would not be too surprising. If you've read very much about the 19th century, you may have noticed that practically everyone had a nervous disorder of some kind when they weren't having syphilis. Jacobson's problem seems to have been that he was a 20th century student of 19th century teachers. This was one problem early in his career. So Jacobson got his PhD in 1910, and in 1910-1911 he was at Cornell on a fellowship to work with the psychologist Edward Titchener, another disappointing experience for Jacobson. By the fall of 1911, he was back in Chicago at the University of Chicago's medical school, and it was in Chicago that he would really begin his career and run the laboratory where he did his important early experiments. Like many pioneers, Jacobson wanted to do something impossible. Unfortunately, no real biography of Jacobson exists, so it's difficult to get a good sense of his motivations and how things exactly unfolded. But it seems that early on he'd become attracted to the psychological method of introspection, or what he preferred to call internal observation. Introspection involves trying to observe what is going on in the mind during various tasks or events. The experimenter might try to observe his or her own mental processes, or might interview others who are instructed to observe their own mental processes. Introspection was used in different ways by Europeans, such as Wilhelm Wundt, the psychologists of the Würzburg School, and Alfred Binet. Jacobson was interested in all of them, but by internal observation, he wanted to focus on what the body was doing during activities involving thought, not just on the imagistic processes of thought itself. Some early experiments on sensation and perception showed that the muscles seemed to be involved in perception. When you relax while looking at a piece of text, for example, eventually the perception of words disappears, and you're left with sensations of color and shape. Jacobson was also, recall, interested in nervousness and tension. Further experiments with relaxation showed that relaxing the muscles seemed also to relax the mind. So he was interested in introspection, and he believed that muscles were somehow involved in thinking. Through his own self-observation, he'd come to notice that when he engaged in some mental activity, groups of muscles also seemed to become activated. But he needed a way to check this, to verify it experimentally. How? Well, in the first decades of the 20th century, some important physiological instruments were invented. We sometimes call these electrophysiological instruments. One of the most important was the electroencephalograph, invented by the German psychiatrist Hans Berger in 1924. Electroencephalography, or EEG, measures brain waves or electricity produced by the brain by neurons. With EEG, you could begin to observe for really the first time what a living human brain was doing. At the same time that EEG was being invented, Jacobson discovered a way to measure the subtle activities of the peripheral nervous system and the muscle fibers. There was an instrument called the string galvanometer, invented around 1901 by a Dutch physician. The string galvanometer could register electrical activity produced by the body, but it wasn't sensitive enough for Jacobson to record the currents of resting muscles and nerves. We know now that even when you're not actively using your muscle, there's a certain background level of electrical potential produced, which is very subtle and which you need a very sensitive instrument to measure. In 1930, Jacobson started working with Bell Telephone Laboratories to develop an amplifier that would allow him to measure a very small electrical potential in a muscle fiber or a nerve of less than a microvolt. So he and Bell, the engineers from Bell Labs, developed what was called an integrating neurovoltmeter, which worked with a string galvanometer. The neurovoltmeter received electrical impulses from very thin wires inserted into muscles or nerve fibers. These electrical impulses were registered by movements of the string of the galvanometer. With this set of tools, and with other electrophysiological technologies that would be developed over the next decades, Jacobson started measuring what the muscles were doing when people thought and imagined and dreamed. This is not easy to do. Jacobson apparently had to enclose his laboratory rooms in copper, change AC wiring to DC, and everyone had to walk around on tiptoes with as little movement as possible so as not to damage this very, very sensitive equipment. He also had to specially train his research subjects in relaxation so that the background tension of their muscles would not cover up the subtle signals he was trying to measure. With this new equipment and carefully controlled lab conditions, something surprising was observed. Acts of recollection or imagination or thought are always accompanied by muscle action potentials, by nerve impulses in relevant parts of the body. If you imagine watching a train going by, for example, your eye muscles contract in a small and particular way as if you were really watching the train going by. You might recall here Skinner's claim that imagining and recollecting are perceiving in the absence of the object perceived. Jacobson also found that when you engage in inner speech, the muscles in your mouth, such as your lips and your tongue, subtly contract. You might recall that this was precisely Watson's hypothesis, and the reverse of this is also true, as I already hinted at. If you relax to the point where the muscles cannot contract, mental events cannot occur. This is one of the cornerstones of progressive relaxation as a therapy. If you find you're having neurotic or otherwise unhealthy thoughts, you simply relax the appropriate muscle groups and the thoughts disappear. Learn to control your muscles, and there is no need for long talks with a psychoanalyst about the contents of your mind. The muscles, as we'll see later on, are the control panel of the mind. Think about this thesis for a moment. You need your muscles to think. Apparently, the musculature is a crucial part of mental activity. No one with the right kinds of scientific instruments and training has been able to show that a thought can occur without some action potential in a relevant muscle group. As Jacobson reminds us, the brain is indispensable, but nobody has ever proved that the brain does all the thinking. This gives new precision to the old behaviorist assertion that you think with your body. Now, Jacobson was not an especially modest person. Of his work in the 1920s and 1930s, he wrote that, for the first time in history, the nature of mental activity became definitively established as a peripheral as well as a central or brain phenomenon. I'll discuss the meaning of central and peripheral below. But Jacobson understood himself to have proved the physical nature of mind and to have given the first measurements of mind in time and space. I think because of this, in some of his writings, you'll find an air of perplexity. When he reviews the theories of other psychologists and philosophers, which tend to be highly speculative, you'll find him wondering why they seem to be unaware of his decades of rigorous experimentation on this topic. In a moment, we'll get more deeply into Jacobson's theory of the mind. First, I want to mention an issue that I've already hinted at, but which is not often brought up these days. This is the issue of centralism versus peripheralism. As you may know, the body has a central nervous system, or CNS, and a peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The CNS is the brain and spine, while the CNS is the brain and spine, while the PNS goes out mostly from the spine all over the rest of the body. If you think the best hypothesis is that mental activity is solely produced by or located in the brain, you're a centralist. If you think that other parts of the body are crucial to mental activity, you're a peripheralist. Not all behaviorists take a clear position on this, I think, but most, as far as I can tell, are peripheralists. Let me dwell on this for another moment, because many people, probably most philosophers and scientists, take centralism for granted. The major philosophers who write about the mind think the mind-body problem is really a mind-brain problem. John Searle is a good example. Some years ago, the neuroscientist Max Bennett and the philosopher Peter Hacker wrote a book called Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience. The book took a quasi-peripheralist perspective without being quite clear about it, and criticized brain-centric philosophers like Searle. The title of Searle's essay in response to the book is telling. His essay was called Putting Consciousness Back in the Brain. It's long been a cornerstone of Searle's philosophy of mind that mental states are entirely caused by brain processes. But he's never explained exactly how this happens. Actually, I don't think he has ever ever defended this assertion. He seems to think it needs no defense, that it's self-evident. Scientific culture in general has the same attitude. Now, part of this, I think, is the brain is just sexy from a research point of view. It provides us with a very complicated technical problem, but one that seems to be well demarcated. We don't need to think about messy things like history or culture or the environment. We just look inside the skull. This is just the sort of clear but technically challenging problem we love to throw money at. So we get these big money projects focused on the brain. In 2013, you might remember, the Obama White House announced the Brain Initiative. And BRAIN here stands for Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, BRAIN. This started out providing more than $100 million per year for neuroscience research. And this amount has been increasing every year. At the National Institutes of Health, which provides some of the funding for this project, neuroscience is usually the third most funded research area after genetics, and actually the first category is kind of a catch-all, so really neuroscience is our second biggest funding priority, genetics being the first. And this year, 2020, there is supposed to be $10 billion available for neuroscience research. In Europe, around the same time as Obama's Brain Initiative, the Human Brain Project got started. The Human Brain Project was supposed to make a detailed supercomputer simulation of a human brain. This was very controversial among scientists, actually, but and it's arguably turned out to be a failure. But it was still given more than $1 billion by funding agencies. These recent sensational examples reflect a funding situation that's been a reality for at least a few decades. This is not to say, of course, that the brain is not important. Remember what Jacobson said, the brain is indispensable, but nobody's ever proved that the brain does all the thinking. As important as the brain is, and we can't get by without one, an fMRI scan or EEG is only going to give you a very narrow picture of what's going on when a human thinks or behaves. Peripheralists think other parts of the body are likely to be significant for mental activity, where centralists focus on how the brain is related to thought using Hans Berger's EEG and later technologies like MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Peripheralists look at the rest of the body using electromyography, which measures skeletal muscle activity, electrooculography, which measures eye activity, electrocardiography, which measures the heart, and so on. There's many similar technologies for measuring different parts of the body, different muscles. This is partly just a practical position. Peripheralism is a practical matter. F.J. McGuigan, who was a follower of Jacobson and an important experimentalist, argued that only the peripheralists can tell us whether or not the body is involved in some important way in thinking. Since peripheralists also pay attention to the brain, McGuigan prefers to call them holists. But anyway, if the brain is not used for thought, this is important to know, but only peripheralists could discover it, since only they systematically measure what the body is and is not doing. If the body is used for thought, again, only peripheralists will be able to discover this. McGuigan puts it like this. By following the holistic strategy, the peripheralist strategy, one cannot fail to achieve truth. That is, if the brain-only position turns out to be true, the holistic strategy would find that out. But if the holistic position turns out to be true, only the holistic strategy would discover that. In other words, most centralists may have a big hole in their theories because, to judge from their writings, they haven't really thought about whether or not the rest of the body is involved in thought. Again, it may not be, but you won't know until you actually look and make measurements. When centralists say things like consciousness is caused by the brain, it sounds like you could take the brain out of the body, and if you could keep it alive somehow, it would still be conscious. So McGuigan calls centralism Donovan's brain theory, after an old science fiction story. It was also a movie about a brain that was kept alive after its owner was killed in a plane crash. Statements that consciousness is caused by the brain or that thinking is a process of the brain sound like scientific truths when stated by eminent philosophers or neuroscientists, but in fact they're simply hypotheses. I've spent a lot of time on background because Jacobson is not known as much as he should be, and because there are some important issues here that are usually ignored today. Now it's time to get into Jacobson's theory of the mind. His most substantial explanation of mind from a peripheralist perspective is found in his book, Biology of Emotions. I'll mainly be referring to this book plus a handful of related articles. He did publish a book called The Human Mind right before he died, but this is mostly a commentary on other people's theories along with some metaphysical speculations. So despite its title, it doesn't add very much that can help us here. In Biology of Emotions, Jacobson gives two definitions of the mind that are useful to begin with. One definition is a functional definition, while the other is a constitutive definition. That is to say, one definition tells us what the mind does, what the mind is for, while the other definition tells us what kind of thing or process the mind is. The functional definition is this. The mind is that energy expending function of the organism by which it programs its behavior. As we'll see, for Jacobson, there are four functions in our responses or adaptations to the environment: perception, evaluation, reflection, and action. Mind, I think, can refer to the first three of these: perception, evaluation, and reflection. Behaviorists usually call these covert behaviors. Jacobson calls them various things like miniature or minuscule or microscopic behaviors that prepare the organism for overt action. Programming here, I should say, means something like selection. In each of the processes of perception, evaluation, and reflection, certain behavioral possibilities are selected and others are rejected. Perception is clearly selective. We never perceive everything that is possible to perceive. Evaluation sets up a particular behavioral framework, for example, fight or flight, which both results from and biases perception. Reasoning or reflection, which I think is basically what other people call reasoning, is a more drawn-out choosing among behavioral alternatives. Jacobson's constitutive definition goes like this. He says, mental operations are constituted by reciprocal retroactivating brain neuromuscular patterns. All behavior could probably be defined in this way, since it all involves patterns of brain and muscle activity. But again, mind is behavior which is covert or minuscule and has a programming function. Jacobson wants to emphasize that mental operations are, like any other bodily operations, neuromuscular, based in the peripheral nervous system, as well as neural or central. By the term reciprocal retroactivating, he wants to point out that there is a kind of circuit or loop involving both the central and peripheral nervous system that is necessary for mind to occur. We'll see later that when you break a part of this circuit, either in the brain or in the muscles, the mind stops. Now, let's look in more detail at the function and constitution of mind, according to Jacobson. So, the function, let's get into the function of mind. I've mentioned that for Jacobson, there are 4 functions and our responses to the environment: perception, evaluation, reflection, and action. If you look carefully, you'll see some key topics in discussions of mind. I've discussed perception and sensation several times in these lectures. Evaluation is going to be connected with emotion and desire, what we have sometimes called affection and conation. Reflection links up with cognition and consciousness, although Jacobson tends to use the word awareness rather than consciousness, in the sense that you can become aware of a thought or perception and able to verbalize it. Jacobson emphasizes that perception, evaluation, reflection, and action do not necessarily make a temporal sequence, in the sense that you begin with perception and then go to evaluation and so on. You are generally always in the middle of some activity or other, so all these things are going on at the same time and are all influencing each other. Our perceptions determine our reactions, and our reactions in part determine how and what we perceive. Nevertheless, we'll go through each of these aspects one by one, just to make each one clear. We'll begin with perception. According to Jacobson, the concepts of sensation and perception are looking at the same phenomenon from different angles. We have to understand here the difference between a signal and a meaning. You can get the distinction by thinking about Morse code. When you communicate a message by Morse code, you send a pattern of electrical signals to another person. The other person has to interpret them, which means figuring out which words the signals represent. All communication is the same in this way. Communication involves making patterns of physical stuff, such as ink or air molecules or electrical potential, which needs to be turned into meanings by some person. By meanings here, I just mean culturally or situationally appropriate responses. Inside the body, communication is basically the same. When the sense receptor nerves in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, pick up something in the environment, some pattern of light or texture or whatever, they send signals, afferent impulses, to the CNS, the central nervous system. We can think of this side of things, the PNS, affecting the CNS as sensation. But at virtually the same time that sensory nerves are sending signals to the CNS is sending motor or efferent impulses to the muscles. And it's this muscle response that designates or determines the meaning of the stimulus. Jacobson sometimes calls the muscular response to sensation a designatory process. It's the body adjusting to the stimulus or beginning to find out the stimulus's meaning. The muscle response might be fairly large, as in the reflexive knee jerk, or it might be small, like an adjustment to the eye muscles, saccade is the technical term, which allows us to focus in a particular way on the object. So this is perception, basically a motoric muscular response to some stimulus involving the sense organs. The CNS effecting the muscles around the PNS sense receptors, in the sense of making them do something. Sensation involves signals from the outer layers of the body sent toward the CNS, whereas perception is sensation subjected to neuromuscular designation. Perception involves going out toward the stimulus. I mentioned earlier that Jacobson found that when people relaxed their muscles while looking at a bit of text, the meaning would tend to disappear and you'd be left with only the raw sensations of color and shape. This probably still involves some slight perceptual activity. When you relax even further, it seems that sensation itself stops, probably in a way that's similar to what happens under anesthetics. I mentioned that there are 4 possible aspects of our response. The next 2, evaluation and reflection, are, I think, equivalent to what some psychologists and philosophers refer to as intuition and reasoning, or what Daniel Kahneman simply called fast thinking and slow thinking. We have probably dozens or hundreds of intuitions every day. We sometimes call them gut feelings as we interpret the various situations that confront us. Sometimes strong emotions are part of that, as in our anger at a car that suddenly cuts us off, or our fear at a sudden loud noise. But in many cases, there's no special emotional component of our evaluation of situations. Evaluation or intuition seems to happen automatically. Jacobson tends to relate evaluation to emotion, and so he thinks of it as largely a function of what he calls the vegetative nervous system, what we also call the autonomic nervous system, which regulates the smooth or involuntary muscles and the glands. We do need to be careful here because the skeletal muscles often respond more quickly than the organs and partly determine the activity of the organs. Also, evaluation is not necessarily emotional as we normally think of that, as an obvious sense of joy or anger or whatever, as I already mentioned. But having emotion in mind, just keeping that idea of emotion in mind, makes it easier to understand the automaticity of evaluation, because we don't normally decide to have emotions. We just find ourselves in a situation and emotion just happens as our evaluation of that situation. It provides an initial evaluation provides an initial behavioral framework within which further responses take place. And emotion can be a part of that framework within which response takes place. It's important to emphasize that evaluation is a muscular response as well as a cerebral spinal or CNS reaction. The reason we feel feelings is because of the peripheral nervous system, which innervates the muscles. For example, Jacobson made a special study of the esophagus. The esophagus tends to contract in difficult situations, and tensions in this and other parts of the body constitute our body's evaluation of the situation. Constriction of the esophagus is part of the feeling of fear or anxiety, the feeling of it. The CNS is involved, of course. Patterns of impulses from the peripheral organs that are set off by environmental stimuli get sorted and integrated by neural patterns in the brain, which send impulses back to the muscles in a constant, complex cycle, or what McGuigan calls a reverberating circuit. But we only have access to the muscular part of this circuit. We're only able to observe and control that part of it. We do not feel or directly control what's going on inside our brains. So although our brains are involved in evaluation too, in everyday life we know about this only insofar as there are visceral or skeletal muscular consequences. Now, some situations are fleeting and some are lasting. If you step into the street and suddenly notice a car quickly bearing down on you, you hopefully don't pause to reflect. Your body evaluates the situation with a speed that is, ideally, faster than that of the car and moves itself back onto the sidewalk. But other situations are spread out over longer periods of time, and reflection or prolonged evaluation, or Kahneman's slow thinking, come into play. Reflection occurs when situations and stimuli confront us lastingly, as Jacobson puts it. In Biology of Emotions, Jacobson gives a couple examples of reflection: anxious reflection and logical reflection. No doubt we could come up with many, many more categories of reflection, but in anxiety reflection, some fear-evoking problem is worked over and over in search of a solution. This process can go haywire and become neurotic or pathological. Anxiety reflection, like all mental activities, is constituted by tension patterns in the musculature. So when it becomes neurotic, when it becomes a central focus, it becomes a drain on your energy and can lead to all kinds of physiological problems, beginning with fatigue and insomnia and so on. And this, the continuous overtension or hypertension of the muscles can lead to cardiovascular diseases and other more serious things. There is a good reason that Jacobson named one of his books "You Must Relax," although the title always sounds a bit authoritarian to me, but actually you can get rid of anxiety reflection by learning to relax the appropriate muscles. For the topic of logical reflection, Jacobson only briefly summarized an unpublished experiment, which is not as helpful as it could have been. Like anxiety reflection, logical reflection is an attempt to solve some problem or achieve some goal. I suppose it can be distinguished from anxiety reflection because it's more disinterested. Logical reflection, or what people like Jonathan Haidt and other psychologists and philosophers call reasoning or slow thinking, seems to involve holding an image in the mind, which is to say, in the muscles. I'll talk about this later. Here I'd mention again Skinner's definition of mental imagery as perception in the absence of the object perceived. It's a physical act of the body. The image is the desired end state, the goal. It might be very abstract, like I want to figure out what to do with my life. Or it might be very concrete, like I want to open that window over there. Various steps or strategies are played through, which are generally provided by the culture and past experience. This playing through might be described as covert or minuscule, as-if behavior. When you're imagining what you could do, your body is actually going through those states at a miniature level. When you actually act toward the goal, the image of the goal continues to be held in the body to be judged against your perceptions of changes to the real-world situation, though you may stop being explicitly or consciously aware of the image. Reflection, like evaluation and perception, is interwoven with overt behavior. If you're trying to solve a complicated math equation, you have some desired end state, such as being able to speak or write down the answer, held as a bodily image. And you're probably alternating covert reflective behavior with overt behaviors, such as writing down and erasing various mathematical symbols. And this overt behavior results in further evaluative and reflective covert behavior until the desired end state is achieved. That is, until the situation is evaluated to be similar enough to the image that was constructed at the beginning. Alright, now since I've been using the word image, I want to mention here that during the early part of Jacobson's career, there was a controversy over mental imagery. This is sometimes called the imageless thought controversy. I've mentioned it before when talking about the behaviorist John Watson. Jacobson's view, based on his own experimental work, was that all individuals with normal capacities had inner imagery, but that some people are more sensitive to it than others. It always occurs when we think, though we're not always aware of it. There's no imageless thought, at least if we're talking about what Jacobson calls reflection. Perception, evaluation, and reflection all involve action in the sense of small-scale muscle tensions. But of course, ultimately, these aspects of behavior must culminate in action, in overt neuromuscular response, because that is how we affect our environments. This, however, takes us out of the domain of mind, as specifically the programming of behavior. So we'll not dwell too long on action itself. Before moving on, I would also point out reasons that Watson and Skinner gave for the existence of covert behavior. Why do we even have covert behavior? They mention things like it saves energy compared to doing the same thing overtly, and there's just some behaviors which we have a social incentive to keep private. Jacobson doesn't mention this, but these reasons seem entirely compatible with his perspective. So we have the function of mind as basically managing behavioral possibilities. Perception and evaluation, generally speaking, serve to narrow down possibilities for behavior, while reflection can in some instances be used to seek a broader range of possibilities. This is the sense in which the mind programs behavior, in which covert behavior programs overt behavior. Now I want to say something about the constitution of mind from Jacobson's perspective, more about what the mind actually is. I've already said a little about this when talking about how perception, evaluation, and reflection work in terms of the muscles and sense receptors and central nervous system. And I've mentioned the strange idea of images held in the body. Earlier, I mentioned Jacobson's definition: mental operations are constituted by reciprocal retroactivating brain neuromuscular patterns. Now, it's time to give a more expansive explanation of this. But first, let me remind you that in the traditional view, the brain receives sensory inputs, which it integrates and tries to make sense of. It decides what to do, then it sends commands to the rest of the body to act. In other words, we're taught to conceive of behavior in a linear fashion, with the brain as a kind of control center that takes in signals from the senses and sends out commands to the muscles. Now, if you have a little knowledge of biology, you'll realize that in practice, things are not going to be quite so simple and linear. But the devil's in the details, and different physiologists are going to give different accounts of what actually happens. For Jacobson, the concept or metaphor of a circuit is going to be very important. This is to evoke a loose analogy with an electronic circuit. Like an electronic circuit, the behaving organism requires energy to get sent back and forth among various parts, and if the circulation of energy gets interrupted at any point, then the function is broken. The organic circuits in a human body are, of course, extraordinarily complicated. In any behavior, overt or covert, there are, Jacobson says, continuing reciprocal impulses back and forth, motor and sensory, between brain and muscle upon the initiation, during, and at or toward the end of the acts. Again, what does not happen is this: the configuration of sense receptors gets simultaneously hit with a configuration of stimuli, and the sense receptors altogether send a volley of impulses to the brain, which figures out, for example, aha, that's my bus, and sends a group of motor impulses to your arm to wave it down. There are instances of very familiar phenomena or sudden life or death phenomena where events probably occur in a way that is very close to this. Your eyes catch a glimpse of an object hurtling toward your head and you duck. This kind of situation maybe has a very small number of loops, or even maybe a single loop in the circuit. But most situations are more complicated. The classic paper on olfaction, the sense of smell, by John Mainland and Noam Sobel gives a good sense of this. Olfaction is maybe the simplest of our sense modalities, but it's still wildly complicated. Odorant perception is affected by all kinds of behavioral factors. The title of Mainland and Sobel's paper is instructive. It was called "The Sniff is Part of the Olfactory Percept." When odorant molecules enter the nostrils, they're caught up in variable airflows depending on which nostril they enter, and depending on the airflow and the type of molecule they stick to, and are sensed by the epithelium in the nasal cavity at different rates. As signals start to get sent to the olfactory bulb in the brain, which starts to send signals to other parts of the brain. The intensity or duration of the sniff gets modified. The muscle activity of the nose gets modified. Some of this muscular adjustment towards the stimulus happens so fast it doesn't appear even to involve the cortex, which is normally thought to mediate sensation and behavior. But the main point is that the sniff is necessary for the perception. If the sniff does not happen, perception does not happen, even if there are odorant molecules floating around in the nasal cavity. You need that reciprocal retroactivating brain muscle circuit for perception to happen, and it changes very quickly when you start smelling something. Your muscles adjust to it. Another way that Jacobson puts this is brain and muscle action in voluntary activities are interlaced and thus are not separable in time. So the concept of interlacing or interweaving of afferent and efferent impulses, impulses to and away from the central nervous system, is perhaps clearer than the phrase reciprocal retroactivation. It needs to be mentioned that there is no clear evidence for closed circuits in the brain, for circuits that only involve different brain regions. Perhaps there are, it seems to me likely that there are, but if there are, it would still need to be demonstrated that these circuits have something to do with what we call mental activities. Instead, it appears that the activities of center and periphery, brain and muscles, are always interlaced, at least in behavior and thought. Imagination is another good example. When you imagine a visual image, there's a tension in your eye muscles. Without this tension, you can't see anything. When you imagine your hand moving, your hand muscles actually contract, unless you just imagine it visually, unless you imagine seeing yourself moving your hand, in which case only your eye muscles might contract. Inner speech and silent reading use the speech muscles, of course, and I suspect some part of the auditory apparatus is involved. Deaf people who've been trained in sign language will have muscle tensions in their hands in addition to, or instead of, their oral speech muscles during thought. McGuigan, I've mentioned a few times, has studied this aspect of thought in great depth. Other types of mental imagery will have their own associated muscle tensions. The point is not that mind is muscle any more than that mind is brain. Rather, mind is the circuit of brain and muscle tension patterns. I suspect we have come to emphasize the head as the location of thought simply because many muscle groups that are important for thought happen to be located in the head. There may be some intuition that our heads are working extra hard compared to the rest of the body when we're thinking. And this is scientifically true, I think, for many kinds of thought, which is to say you can demonstrate it experimentally. Not only brain and muscles are involved, of course. We can and should extend this principle beyond physiology. In my view, Jacobson doesn't really get into this too much, but in my view, the circuit that constitutes mental behavior should in fact be understood to include the environmental stimuli as well. I'll mention an example having to do specifically with thought or problem solving, which comes from B.F. Skinner. There's an old idea in popular culture that if you're stuck on a problem you're trying to solve, you can take a break from it or sleep on it, and your brain will continue to work on the problem unconsciously. Later, the solution will suddenly pop into your mind. But Skinner points out that the more likely explanation in many such cases is that you've changed your inner and outer environments. And this has changed while you're working on the problem unconsciously. You've changed your inner and outer environments, and this has changed your whole relationship to the problem. Variables that had interfered with a solution get weaker over time, while new variables that support a solution may turn up. Thinking as problem solving involves not just patterns of activity in the brain and in the muscles, but manipulation of the environment. Related to this, Morse Peckham has pointed out that many intellectual laborers go through seemingly, but only seemingly, random patterns of behavior when they're stuck on a problem. They might smoke a cigarette or twirl their mustache, garden, cooking, playing the piano, things like that. What they're doing is interacting with and changing their environments in ways that have in the past weakened variables that had started to interfere with problem solving and yielded productive variables that stimulated new insights. Thinking not only goes on in the brain and in the rest of the body, it also goes on in the world, in an environment. It is interlaced or interwoven with an environment. It's futile, I think, to put, as John Searle would like to, consciousness back in the brain. A brain whose activities are not interlaced with environmental sensation and muscle contraction is a brain without consciousness. To drive this point home, I want to give a review of Jacobson's evidence for the constitutive role of muscle tension in mental activity, which he himself provides in Biology of Emotions. Jacobson mentions 5 kinds of evidence. So first, carefully trained observers report muscle tension patterns beginning with the onset of mental activities, such as remembering or imagining. So when you start remembering, your muscles start working. Second, this kind of observation is verified by electrophysiological measurement techniques, such as EMG, electromyography, and other similar techniques. Third, when subjects trained in relaxation allow the action potentials in their muscles to fall below 1 microvolt, perception, memory, emotion, and other mental activities diminish and disappear. Fourth, individuals who relax to this point, to near 0 levels of action potential, simply appear to observation to be thoughtless, sensationless, and emotionless. Just look blank, vacant. Reflexes such as the knee-jerk diminish or are absent. The 5th bit of evidence concerns time relations. Jacobson claims that the experimental data do not show that brain activity precedes muscle activity in the sense that the brain makes up a plan of action and then sends signals to the muscles to carry it out. His combined EEG and EMG recordings indicated that brain and muscle were activated essentially simultaneously. There was not enough of a time difference to conclude that the brain on its own planned the action. If brain and muscle potentials were not exactly simultaneously, sometimes the EEG spiked before the EMG, but sometimes the EMG spiked first. There was no clear evidence for the traditional view of the brain as control center. From Jacobson's perspective, there is as much justification to say that the muscles control the brain as that the brain controls the muscles. Remember, it's like a circuit. This will be controversial for various reasons, but for one thing, around the time that Jacobson was writing Biology of Emotions in the 1960s, a couple of German neuroscientists discovered something they called the Bereitschaftspotenzial, or readiness potential in English. Readiness potential. Readiness potential is a measurement of activity in the motor cortex and related brain areas that precedes volitional voluntary activity, voluntary muscle movement. It is also not normally visible on EEG. You need to use a special reverse averaging technique to see it. The readiness potential precedes movement by a second or two, so some people think it's evidence of the brain planning the body's movements or something like that. There are a number of complications here. One is that readiness potential is an event-related potential, or thought to be an event-related potential, meaning that it occurs in response to some event, such as the anticipation of action, which we have already seen is inextricably neuromuscular, so it requires some muscular action to set it off in the first place. Since the readiness potential occurs over a relatively long time span, more than a second, whereas electrophysical currents are often measured in tens and hundreds of milliseconds. So since it occurs over this longer period of time, there's likely some peripheral component to it also. And in fact, in readiness potential studies, the EMG component, which could tell us whether or not muscle action potentials are systematically correlated with the readiness potential, has not been very well done. At least So far, in trying to look at some of these studies, the authors haven't been very clear about how the EMG was done. For example, where the electrodes were placed, how sensitive the EMG was, what kind of subjects were used, how were they prepared, and so on. Without carefully and systematically done EMG readings, it's hard to have any clear idea about where the readiness potential fits into the ecology of behavior. Anyway, we've just spent some time considering what mind is in physical terms. I want to conclude with one important implication of this, the issue of mind control. All right, I'm going to discuss here an article by Jacobson called Neuromuscular Controls in Man. Neuromuscular Controls in Man. By man, of course, he just means people in general. This was written back in the 1950s. It's become well known that how you use your muscles can affect how you feel. If you smile, you'll feel happier. If you hold your body in a confident posture, you'll feel more confident. This would not have surprised Jacobson. If what we feel to be mental acts are determined by muscle contractions, then learning to control our muscle contractions give us better control over our minds. Jacobson thought of our skeletal muscles as our control system, or what he sometimes called our autogenous controls. Autogenous just refers to something that comes from within a particular thing, something which is native to that thing. He compares the human organism to a car to bring out some of the similarities and differences. The car has a control panel inside where the driver can make relatively small adjustments that have a big effect on what the car actually does. Humans, and this is true of all animals, also have a control panel, our skeletal muscles. We make our bodies go by contracting and relaxing our muscles. Now, one of the interesting things about the human control panel, or the animal mammalian control panel, is that it's found all over the body. And this is why organic bodies are such incredibly intelligent machines. The car, at least when Jacobson was writing in the 1950s, only had a control panel in the dashboard. It was a kind of a stupid machine, although car manufacturers have been trying to make cars smarter and smarter by extending the control system. Now, the car has a few indicators that let you know how it's doing, the speedometer, the fuel gauge, and so on. Likewise, the body, though the body's indicators are not so explicit. The indicators of the body are muscle sensations, or what Jacobson calls the muscle sense. But there's a problem in that most of us are not very well trained to read these indicators. And because of this, we are mechanically inefficient. To attain some goal, we often pay too high a price in muscle tension. We run our bodies into hypertensive states. Progressive relaxation for Jacobson is training for differential relaxation, which is learning to tense only as much as is necessary and no more. Let me quote an important paragraph. Jacobson writes, "It is a requisite that he, a patient, be taught to distinguish the control sensation from other types of sensation, that he learn to detect this control as an element present in the subjective experience of mental activities, including imagination, recollection, and emotion, and that he acquire the habit of using this control in his daily living. To this end, he needs to be trained to observe his own sensational processes when he is facing daily problems and making adjustments to the environment. It is imperative that he become accustomed to distinguish the controls, which he is learning to observe as sensations, but also to use practically, from the problem which he tries to solve." Let me go do that again. It's imperative that he become accustomed to distinguish the controls from the problem which he tries to solve. The instruction may be worded, "Distinguish between issue and tension attitude." Thus he, the patient, may recognize to the point where he may progress to the point where he recognizes that even fears and anxiety states include a measure of his own efforts to meet the environment, and accordingly can be rendered more subject to daily control. All right, so in other words, don't let a situation and past tension habits overdetermine your response. Freedom and health both lie in finding the best tension attitude for the situation. As Jacobson pointed out, this has important psychological implications. A phobia, for example, can be cured by noticing the tensions that appear in a phobia-inducing situation and learning to relax those tensions away. A patient that Jacobson sometimes mentions was an attorney who, when he was high up in a building, had a fear of jumping out of the window, in addition to various other stress-related problems. Over a couple of years, this attorney learned and practiced progressive relaxation. When he became skilled at observing his muscle tensions, Jacobson gradually had him work up to imagining himself jumping out of a window. When he became aware of the muscle tensions involved in this activity, he was instructed to relax them away. He seemed to improve after this, and later, among other changes in his life that could be mentioned, Jacobson tells us that the attorney actually moved his office to the tower of a high building. All right, so I've covered a lot in this lecture. Here are some key points to remember. Jacobson agrees with the main behaviorist tenet that mind is covert behavior. This covert behavior can be measured using tools such as electromyography. This is extremely difficult to do well, however. Jacobson thought the main function of mind was programming other behavior. He gave 4 aspects to behavior as adaptational response: perception, evaluation, reflection, and action. I said that what we normally call mind is the first 3 of these things. Mind actually is a circuit. So that was the function. So talking about what mind is, it's a circuit involving electrical activity in the central and peripheral nervous systems, which includes contractions of the voluntary and involuntary muscles. Recall that there is a hidden debate between centralists, who think the mind is just in or is just caused by the brain, and peripheralists, who think the peripheral nervous system, the peripheral systems have important roles to play in mental activity. The control panel of the mind is the voluntary skeletal muscles. We engage in thought by engaging these muscles. And we can cease mental activity by relaxing these muscles. By learning to observe our muscle sense, we can improve our mechanical efficiency and thus our intelligence and health. And finally, a personal note about Jacobson's legacy. Unfortunately, as with Morse Peckham, there does not seem to have been any institutional effort to maintain his legacy. Jacobson's correspondence is sometimes found in the archives of other individuals, but he also left behind at least some and probably many unpublished manuscripts when he died, as well as various other artifacts from his career. I have no idea what could have happened to these. Most of his books are out of print and hard to find. And this situation is strange, since Jacobson is one of our most important physiologists. And physiology does not usually get the public notice of psychology or even philosophy. But as I think the work of Jacobson shows, it can be as important to how we live and how we think about the world as the other 2 disciplines. All right. Thank you for listening.